Well, I hope everyone in different ways or that you are having enjoyable things happening this summer. We certainly have. A week ago Wednesday, our grandson Micah was born. Everyone's doing well. We're thrilled. We're having fun. So it's a good summer for us. Hope it is. Hope you're finding blessings in it. So this morning I want to talk about the woman in this story. And let's see how I can get us to think about what's going on with her and how it speaks to us about purity, impurity, and love. How does all of that intersect? So in thinking about this story, one of the things I noticed, we follow the flow of the story, how it comes out, what happens. We understand that part, so I'm not going to go over that part. A couple of things are interesting. One is that Jesus doesn't, by his choice and will, heal this woman, which tells us something, that the quote-unquote power of Jesus was not under his control. He wasn't deciding, I think I'll do this, and I think I'll do that, kind of like, I don't know, a wizard or something. No. It's actually the Father, his Father, who's working through him, and his Father is aware of this woman. Jesus is just aware of what happens. Woo, something happened. But he didn't choose to do it. I think that's interesting. It's the Father's tender, caring concern for this woman, knowing more, I think, about this woman than Jesus perhaps does. I don't think he knows or has known what's going on with her, but the Father's aware, just like he's aware of what's going on with each of us. And so she's healed of 12 years, a dozen years of suffering with hemorrhaging and doctors who tried to help her, and it's only gotten worse. And she's spent all her money. And you notice in verse 33, it says, "But the woman, fearing and trembling, comes forward." Why is she fearing and trembling? Well, you got to understand something about the culture of the day. Is that Moses' law had a lot to say about cleanliness and uncleanliness, about purity and impurity. And certain people were seen as being impure. Certainly, if you were a kind of obvious sinner, you were impure morally. But the law did not distinguish between people who did things wrong and people who simply had misfortune. That sometimes the misfortune of having contracted leprosy was enough to make you impure, as if you were the most reprehensible sinner in the whole world. No one could touch you, and you could not touch anyone else. Because the prevailing mentality of the law was that which is clean is always in danger of being tainted and stained and soiled by what is impure. It's like purity is fragile, while impurity is strong. The interesting thing about Jesus is he doesn't believe that. He believes that what is pure in him is stronger and greater than what is impure in others. And so he happily goes around touching the impure, and guess what does happen? He doesn't end up tainted and stained, they end up being cleansed. He understands something that the law did not talk about, is the greater power of good over evil or trouble or misfortune, because, like I said, the law made no distinguishing, between the person who's just out and out doing awful, terrible things and the person who's simply suffering with a disease. They were just all put in the category of the impure. The reason this woman's afraid is she has just done something taboo, forbidden. She knows she's impure. Her bleeding makes her impure, and it's made her impure for 12 years. She's not able to go to temple. She's not able to do, sometimes we call this ceremonially unclean. That's a way of talking about what the law was saying, is she could not participate in any of the ceremonies because she was impure. She was unclean. She was soiled, filthy, disgusting. And people saw her that way, and they didn't want to touch her because then they would have to go through this cleansing process, and there was time involved, and you had to do all this stuff according to the law and offer a sacrifice, and then after a period of time, you could finally say, okay, I'm clean again. You don't want to touch her, and you don't want her touching you, because now you've got this whole process to go through to become clean again. So, of course, she's afraid. She's made Jesus unclean by everything that Jews have been thinking about, talking about, and practicing for centuries. So she's afraid. But I admire her for being honest, because I know what I would have done in that situation. I would have lied my head off, right? What? I don't. Who did that? That would have been my tendency, is like to try and just lie and don't let them know it was me. But she's bold. She's bold enough to be honest and say, yeah, it was me, even though people are going to be angry at me. Jesus may be angry at me. People are going to say, oh, I'm an awful person. How could I do that knowing the consequences of touching him? But she's honest. Maybe she's honest because she knows she was healed. I don't know if that's, or maybe she was a better person than me and would have been honest anyway. But she's honest about it. She tells exactly what's been going on. That she's an impure, filthy woman, and yet she hatched this plan, and it seems like it's worked. So I want us to think a little bit about what Jesus is doing in his ministry. I said he has this confidence that the cleanliness of God overpowers the soiled nature of things in the world. That's what Jesus understands about his Father, and so that's how he lives. And he's not afraid that he's ever going to end up unclean. It takes a long time for his disciples to figure this out. It takes a vision on a rooftop for Peter, and still he talks about how reluctant he is to be in Cornelius's house. I've never been in the house of a Gentile. Why? Because he has this visceral revulsion against Gentiles, right? It's deep-seated. He feels it in his gut. He feels like, ooh, this is a disgusting house. These are filthy people. And here I am being urged by God to go in and eat with them. Green eggs and ham, right? It's disgusting. So I want us to think a little bit about disgust. So there's a psychology of disgust. There is the foremost, as I understand, psychologist who's done research into disgust is a guy named Dr. Paul Rodin from the University of Pennsylvania. And he's done a lot of social research trying to look at the human impulses of disgust. And so he did this little social experiment to demonstrate it. So Dr. Paul Rodin would take a glass of orange juice, and he would drop a dead roach in it, stir it around, pull the roach out, and ask anyone in the audience, would they like to have a drink of the orange juice? Nobody does, right? Of course nobody does. The roach has made the orange juice tainted, filthy. But then he proceeds, in the presence of the audience, to strain the orange juice, to sanitize the orange juice, to boil the orange juice, to get it to a place where intellectually we know this is now clean. And he asked people in the audience, would you like to drink it? Very few will take him up. There's some people you can dare to do things, and they'll do it. Because that's just their personality. Like, you dare me, I'll do it. But most people are still going to be like, even if I know intellectually that whatever might have contaminated this orange juice has now been thoroughly removed, I still have this visceral sense of disgust. I can't bring myself to drink it. I don't know if Paul Rodin talks about this, but in thinking about this idea, it occurs to me from my training in cultural anthropology that so much of this is cultural. That we grow up in a culture which defines for us what is disgusting, what is filthy, and what then we have this deep-seated reaction against. Even if we know in our heads, maybe it's not. It's just kind of baked in. We learned it. Some illustrations could be, we in our culture do not eat insects. I mean, all insects are considered dirty, right? We spray, we swat, we step on them, we want to get rid of them. There's a lot of cultures in the world where some insects are delicacies. I was thankful that the Tanzanians never fed me an insect because I knew I would have to eat it. I mean, that's what Paul says, eat whatever is set before you. Fortunately, though they did eat locusts, they never thought, I guess, to serve it to their guests. So I never had to swallow hard and try not to throw up, because I would have, and would have found that disgusting. But there's a lot of cultures where culturally it's not disgusting. The Maasai, the nomadic people of the Serengeti, who cattle herders famous for their, you can't be a man until you have touched a lion. Those guys, they're fierce. Everyone's scared of the Maasai. But you know how they greet each other? You can look this up on YouTube. There's videos and stuff. The Maasai greet each other by spitting on one another's chest. Walk up to someone, good to see you, and just spit right on their chest, and they spit on yours. Now, we would find that disgusting, right? Because for us, spit is filthy. So filthy that if you spit in a cup till you get a fair amount in there, will you drink it? Probably not. It'll turn your stomach, the idea of even drinking, but it's your own saliva. It came out of your mouth. But see, we're so convinced it's filthy that it's just kind of sickening to think about drinking your spit. Okay, these are cultural things. And the problem with disgust about things that we think are impure is it's not controlled by what we know in our heads. It's dictated by a more primal kind of instinctual revulsion. And that's why it's really hard to love people that we think are filthy and disgusting. But Jesus somehow is doing that, right? He's grown up in a culture where this woman, where lepers, where flagrant sinners like prostitutes and tax collectors are all filthy, disgusting, awful people. And you stay away from them. And yet somehow he's gotten to a place in his own personal walk with his Father that he eats with them and he touches them. And I don't know if he had some difficulty doing that. It's always difficult kind of the first time you do something new, but it gets easier the more you press on and keep doing it, you know. I'm not supposing that it was easy for him to break those social mores because all the social rules say you have to behave this way. I mean, a lot of the criticism against Jesus was he eats and drinks with sinners. His disciples aren't instructed to carefully wash their hands before they eat. Where's all the ritual washings? Where's all the emphasis on purity and cleanliness? He was not following that. And in fact, he was loving in spite of those cultural norms. See, the problem is that disgust raises barriers and love dismantles them. But the barriers that disgust raises are not easily dismantled even by a person's willingness to love. Right? So we've all heard the phrase, oh, love the sinner and hate the sin. There's some truth to that. I get that. But it's so hard to do. It's easy to say. It's extremely hard to do. It's not so hard to do if you're not disgusted by their sin, but it's really hard to do if you find something kind of icky about their sinfulness. And when you do, all the thought about I need to love this person is up against this very deep-seated psychological matrix that has you in revulsion against it. So what do we do? Reading the book, Miroslav Volf's book on exclusion and embrace, he talks about the ministry of Jesus. He says, by embracing the outcast, Jesus understood the sinfulness of the person and the systems that had cast them out. I mean, Jesus wasn't a person who was declaring, oh, nobody around here is sinful. He understood, in fact, everybody's sinful. My problem is I'm only disgusted about certain sins, and I'm usually not very disgusted about my own, right? I make excuses for my own. I think my own can sometimes be reasonable. I mean, there's a good reason I don't do things well in this regard. I mean, literally, I should be as disgusted with my own sin as I can be about certain sins of others, but I'm not, right? I'm only disgusted about certain sins. And so we say, well, all sins are equal, but in practice, some make us have this reaction of revulsion and some don't. And so they're really not equal in terms of my existential reality, the way I live. Some seem worse to me than others. And again, intellectually, I say they're all the same. But in practicality, that's hard to live out. But Miroslav Volf says Jesus understood the sinfulness. He wasn't discounting it, but he also understood the systems that had cast these people out. And that he was undoing. The systems of exclusion, which were based on a sense of purity that nobody had, but that some kind of thought they had, like they managed despite. The Pharisees thinking they were pure, they weren't. So he goes on to say, the mission of Jesus consisted not simply of renaming the behavior that was falsely labeled sinful. Sometimes Jesus realized that what people were calling sinful was not in fact sinful. And so he renamed it. He said, no, it's not to be labeled sinful. Not everything in his day that was called sinful was. But he also was involved in remaking the people who have actually sinned. And he did that, I think, through his touch, through his refusal to be one who saw them as disgusting. Not discounting the fact that they had problems in their lives, and he understood that, but he started to remake them. See, the rehabilitation starts when Jesus says to Zacchaeus, I want to go and eat in your house today. When does Zacchaeus say, you know what? I am going to make right anything I've done wrong? When does he do that? He doesn't do that, and then Jesus says, now I'll go eat with you. He does that after Jesus says, let me come to your house and eat with you. And Jesus, when he's in his house, says to the people, this man too is a child of Abraham. He's refusing to exclude Zacchaeus. He's not ignoring the fact that Zacchaeus may have done a lot of people wrong. But the change that happens with Zacchaeus in his heart occurs because Jesus goes and dines with him. He's willing to touch him. He's not going to exclude him. And that starts to change Zacchaeus. I think maybe there's a suggestion for us in how we move forward. Number one, I am admitting that I myself, maybe not you, I have a problem with disgust. And it rears its head about certain things that I find particularly repulsive. And there's certain people that really make me feel that way. And yet I have this witness of Jesus that that's not okay. That's not his way. And so I end up in the place of saying, help me, Lord Jesus. How can I overcome this culturally embedded, deeply psychological revulsion to what is going on? How can I get past it? And I have to trust him that he's going to help me to be able to touch people, eat with people, welcome people, and see how they are blessed and begin to change because they're loved instead of excluded. Someone else I want to quote is Walter Brueggemann, if you know him. He's the eminent Old Testament scholar. He talks about the twin ideas of mercy and sacrifice. We know from Hosea says that God is declaring, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And Walter Brueggemann explores what is the difference in the tradition of mercy and the tradition of sacrifice. He says the tradition of sacrifice focuses on the sacrificial life of the community, seeking a restoration of lost holiness so that God's presence can be found again. I mean, the whole tradition of sacrifice was how to get rid of what is unholy. That's what sacrifice was doing. It was to rid ourselves of our unholiness so that we could be holy, so that we could have communion with God. Walter Brueggemann says the tradition of mercy concerns the community and urges drastic and rehabilitative activity. So there is a tension between sacrifice, which is focused on ridding ourselves of the stain, and mercy, which is focused on rehabilitating where there is stain, right? Where there is sin. And so if you understand the tension that's there, it's amazing when you hear Hosea declare that God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And I think Jesus heard that well, that the emphasis is not on we need a sacrificial system that rids ourselves of all the impurity so that we can be pure and God can be present. That was more the Pharisaical mindset. The emphasis is on the sacrificing that brings purity. And Jesus' emphasis was upon the mercy that rehabilitates, that heals people because they are impure. There's the tension. And there's the declaration of Scripture as to where we need to land on that. The ways in which we can cease doing things that are not helpful to us or our neighbors, those ways are good. I need to learn to be less, critical, hot-tempered at times, impatient, judgmental, all the things prideful, that's my biggie, prideful. All the things that I do wrong, I need to learn to, as best I can, lessen and lessen how those play out in my life. That's kind of the sacrifice part. But more important than that is the emphasis on mercy towards others. Maybe sacrifice towards myself, but mercy towards them. When it comes to me, I need to clean house and rid myself of all the darkness that abides in me. But when it comes to them, I need to have the mercy that will ultimately bring their healing. Okay, nothing I said is easy. Not if you're listening, right? It's not easy. So let's just be honest. This is difficult. We have trouble. God knows that. But let us aspire to be a community that's trying to live beyond our cultural imprinting, what we've learned and where we've been, and our kind of instinctual reactions. What does it look like when love rules and it's more important than purity? And in fact, it brings about purity. I think that's the call of God.